Hey, Faith Unfiltered podcast friends and family. This is Blake Smith, project manager here at Faith Unfiltered. This Fair Trade episode features Mary Cusack, who happens to be a member of the What's Brewing Cafe panel. And we've broken the conversation between Mary and host Robin Linkhart into two parts. This is part one of that conversation. We hope you enjoy it and come back for part two.
Hello, and welcome to Fair Trade, a Faith Unfiltered podcast series where courageous people share the candid stories of their faith journey and what brought them to Community of Christ. I'm your host, Robin Linkhart, and I'm here today with Mary Cusack. Mary, thanks so much for being with us today on Faith Unfiltered.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. Thanks.
Well, we are just so pleased that you're willing to share your story with us today. We kind of like to start at the beginning, like, if you just met somebody and you had a couple minutes to introduce yourself, what would you say?
Okay. Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I have a Brooklynese accent, which I'm very happy with. I was a Catholic. That was my background. So that was everything I ever had. I am a retired school psychologist right now, from the Department of Education. I'm married. I'm with my wife for 20 years. That's our gay-versary, but we've been married for 16 years. I have 3 stepdaughters and that are aged 19 to 39. I have 3 grandkids. And right now I went to seminary and we graduated in December. So it's been kind of like getting used to not being in seminary and having all these books to read and all this really interesting stuff to do. So there's been a little bit of a dip since December, but I am getting more involved with church stuff. So that's kind of been taking up a lot of, and which I can go into later.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my thing overall.
Thank you. That's great. And congratulations for graduating from Community of Christ Seminary. That was a high point of my life. And, it was such a joy. And at the same time, I was wondering if I would actually live through it because as you well know, it's a hard thing, but oh gosh, it's so good. Okay. So now we're going to kind of wind the clock back, and we are very interested about your story of faith and God and church all throughout your growing up years, but we also want to hear about you. And so just start at the beginning. You've told us a little bit about where you were born and your faith of your childhood, but take us from birth to high school and don't leave anything out.
Well, with birth, I'm not that much. I don't know that much, really. A little bit. My birth mother she was an unmarried person, and so I was given up for adoption really young. I was adopted at about 6 months. But the adoption, everything in my life, culturally and religiously, has been informed by being a Catholic. So the place I was in as an infant was called Angel Guardian, and it was, run by these Sisters of Mercy, I think. And my parents were very devout Catholics, and they had to jump through, I guess, a lot of hoops to be able to adopt me. But I think that being adopted, for better or worse, has had an effect on me in terms of maybe feeling like I was given up and whatever. I've had to really work through that over the years as I've gotten older, and I've really come a long way with it. But I knew when I was very little, so I guess I was figuring it all out as a little kid, like probably 5 or something. I knew. They sat down and talked to me about it. Anyway, they were devout Catholics, and I grew up in a home where we had a lot of stuff in the house, like pictures of Jesus, and we had you probably won't know what this reference is, but we have the Stations of the Cross, which is oh, you've heard of this. It's 12 or 14 different spots or stops or really important things that Jesus did on the road to Calvary. So we had that. We had a big picture of the Sacred Heart, which is a devotion my mother had about the heart of Jesus and the fire of love from the heart of Jesus. My mother said the rosary. This was my home, and we kept all the holidays. We kept, we didn't eat meat on Fridays or Wednesday. We did all of that. And even if we went away somewhere, my parents found a church for us to go to no matter what. And I have to say that just watching them, I think I got a good sense of real, authentic love that my parents had for God, despite maybe some of their failings or difficulties like we all have. I knew that was real, and they didn't nobody would know it. If you were out in the street, you knew them. It wasn't like they were these pious-y people. They were very humble people. But I could see in my home, and it impacted on me. And I think it also gave rise to my own wanting to have a relationship with God, with Jesus. So I was one of these kids. One of my friends told me I was kind of a nerd in this way. Like, I love to get little books about the Bible. There was a Catholic store in our neighborhood, and I would go there and get books about different stories in the Bible. I asked for, a children's Bible when I was a kid. I just loved it. And I loved saying prayers. That was one of the first things they taught me in my house, was to say the Our Father. And then also we said the Hail Mary. So those things were really influential. I liked going into church. I love the atmosphere. Back then, we're talking about the 60s, mid 60s. It could be like dark, sort of, and there would be these votive candles, and they were usually red, and they cast this sort of very, it cast an aura for me. I thought it was beautiful. I thought the idea of lighting a candle for an intention for somebody that you loved and leaving that little light there for them, I thought that was really beautiful. There was paintings in the church. The church was called Our Lady of Angels, and we had a big in the front painting of Mary of the Our Lady of Angels with all the little angels around it. I mean, I was just really entranced by all of that stuff. So, that was something I don't think that came from my parents. That was already in me. I was in love with God. So I guess at some point, though, I started to realize that that I liked girls. I think it was definitely before I went to first grade. I started becoming aware that I had crushes on girls, and I kind of thought, oh, there's something really wrong with this. Maybe I remember thinking one day, walking down the alley, am I the only person in the whole world like this? Everybody else is not like this. You didn't know, but I thought, oh my God, and I think it tied into the adoption. I was like, I can never say this. As much as my parents love me, I don't think they would love me if they knew this. Because what I was learning was that not only was it abnormal, but I was learning that it was sinful. So my very nature was a sin. And that was very painful to me and confusing to me, because I thought, well, I don't want to be like this. I don't want to be sinful and hurt God or be offensive to God, just being who I am. And I thought, why am I like this? I don't want to be like this. But it came naturally to me. It was totally in my nature. It wasn't anything I consciously decided. I also was a tomboy. I was a stereotypical, tomboy. I found the games with the girls boring. I didn't want to play games where we played with babies. You know what I mean? I wanted to be out jumping in the dirt, climbing. I was hanging out with boys that we'd climb fences. We'd, pretend we were in a war or something, because one of the boys had Boy Scout shirts. So we'd put these shirts on and be crawling around in the dirt and things, and just nonsense, a lot of rough and tumble things that were interesting to me. The other stuff wasn't. Although it's interesting, I am non-binary, which means I don't really identify as either necessarily male or female. And I think we all have different degrees of male and female in us anyway, actually, whatever you call yourself. But I tended to really identify more with males in a lot of ways, my tastes, what I liked. We used to play a game called Queen, and one of the girls was the queen. I always made myself like the page or something so that I could sort of be this innocuous figure that got to be male and nobody thought twice about it. And I'd just be, the whole game, I'd be going and delivering messages to the king or something like that. But it was ways I could fit who I was into playing with the kids and stuff like that. Anyway, I guess by the time I hit puberty, it became more of a crisis because, I was becoming more womanly, and I thought, I really tried to start to consciously act more feminine, like to pull out whatever femininity I had in me, and develop that more, because I think the difference when you go into your teen years is really stark. It's much more than when you're like 7. I mean, when I'm 7, people thought I was a boy. Like, I had short hair, and the kids, when you're 7, 6, you can't necessarily tell the difference between boys and girls. And certainly I tried to butch up my clothing as much as I could. Like, I had girls' clothes, but I'd cut the sleeves off, or, I'd get as masculinely girly clothes as I could to run around in. So anyway, so I started to realize all of this stuff, and I did sort of like some boys. Like, there's, the Kinsey scale, where it's like, what is it, 0 to 6, and 6 you're fully one way, and 0 you're fully the other way. And that most of us really don't fall into these end poles of anything, that there may be a little bit tweaky there. So I thought, well, what I'll do is that boys were like my friends. I'd rather be with them. So I thought, I'll just get a boyfriend, and then that's it. I'll just get married out. And then I started thinking, like, the martyr thing, like, where, well, I may be this way, but I don't have to live this way. I can make the choice to, carry this cross in my life. And going to high school was terrible in a lot of ways, although I have a couple of people that I'm still friendly with that had no idea. They say they had no idea I was suffering the way I was and everything. There was some drinking that went on in my family. And yeah, I would say like really heavy drinking with some members of my family. And there was depression in my house too. So I also felt really odd and weird for those reasons. Like, I didn't always have clean clothes or something. And I was self-conscious about that too, as well as just not fitting in the other way. And I remember always trying to watch people that I knew to figure out what normal people did, how they acted, so that I could do that. I think I was kind of dissociative too in a lot of ways. I think I really was out of it. I didn't know myself. I didn't want to know myself because I didn't think very good things about myself. I didn't think I was good enough ever. So it was kind of difficult to try to fashion an image and I think kids that are teenagers, I've worked with teenagers my whole life now. And probably because that was the worst time in my life, I wanted to work with kids and help them. They have identity issues at that point anyway. That's like kind of a normal thing that kids, teenagers go through. Like, who am I? And do I fit in? I'm insecure. I mean, I don't think that that's so abnormal. I think a lot of people go through that. Mine was really filtered through, like, feeling ashamed of my home and feeling ashamed of myself and thinking, like, if people really knew who I was, they wouldn't want to be my friend. And I guess by my teens, it was like the 70s. So there was a little bit of change going on, I would say. Like, some celebrities were saying they were bisexual, like Elton John, a couple of tennis players, Martina Navratilova, I think. I don't know if she said it by the 70s, but by the 80s she did. But people, some people were starting to say stuff like that. Although in my girls' high school, that wasn't permissible. Like, that was the last thing. And it was a girls' school, so I was very self-conscious. This is like an aside, and it's not even religious, but they used to do something, they called it Leslie Thursdays. And on Thursday, you weren't supposed to, like, wear purple or something. And they would joke around and be like acting flirty. And I mean, we didn't do it every week, but sometimes they did it. And I was mortified. Like, I didn't know, I was sweating like so much with that kind of silly behavior, but I was really scared. And I remember too, in the religion class, they did presentations about different things, like they did euthanasia and they did homosexuality. And I remember that day, like wishing I could just dig a hole and crawl in, because I thought, I hope nobody notices me or I don't stand out. You know, you tend to think everybody notices you when you have these horrible self-conscious things going on. Anyway, I started to, by my late teens, I had a good friend who I had a crush on, and she had a cousin, and she wanted to fix me up with the cousin. And I had already discovered alcohol by the time I was a teenager. And I found that when I drank, I didn't feel self-conscious. I actually felt sort of like I had some self-esteem. And it sort of melted away. I had a lot of anxieties. I still am an anxiety person. It melted away the anxieties and made things easier for me. And I didn't really care what people thought of me when I drank. So anyway, and I liked sports growing up and stuff. So she told her cousin, this guy, I know a girl who likes to drink beer and play basketball. And he was interested. So we started to date. I don't think he was very into me at first. I guess I was an acquired taste, maybe, I don't know. But I thought he was very good looking. And we dated for a little while. He broke up with me because I wasn't fast enough for him. But I was a good Catholic girl, so I wasn't going to go too fast anyway. But I think he realized that there was something maybe about me that was more than just, like, I wasn't a femme girl, and guys like that. And I wasn't that person. I wasn't gorgeous. I was kind of cute, but I wasn't gorgeous or anything. Well, and I think when he first broke up with me, he was like, it's because you're more like a guy, like friends, like than a girlfriend. But I think over some time, he kind of appreciated that. So he kept trying to ask me out again. And I kept telling him, no, I wouldn't do it. And then finally I gave in and we went out. And so I was with him for quite a number of years. But I also, during that period of time, and I loved him, but it wasn't enough. And my drinking was getting worse. And I was realizing, well, if it doesn't work with him, it's not going to work with anybody, because I love him. And I think he's so good looking. And he was such a good person. And we clicked really well. And all I could think of was, I'm going to get pregnant and end up being on the couch drunk with a baby in a playpen or something. So anyway, and also my drinking got to the point where I would go into blackouts sometimes, and I would admit that I was a lesbian to different people. I mean, I knew lesbians in the sports world that I lived in. And I remember thinking, like, I'm not like them, I'm not like those people. But I hated myself for having the feelings. They were really crushes. They weren't anything deeply physical, or, do you know what I mean? Or erotic or anything. It wasn't anything like that. It were more like crushes. But I didn't get those on boys, really. But I remember hating myself because of my feelings and because I couldn't be like everybody else. But I also remember hating myself for not letting myself be who I was. And so you get drunk. So I think I went up to some girl and said, hey, if I was a lesbian, would you go out with me or something? And she said, yes. But then the next day I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. This is going to get around. And so anyway, finally, the drinking got out of control and he broke up with me because he drank, but he could go home. I'd say, leave me with $5 and I'll see you tomorrow or something. I'd still stay out. All this time I was still going to church, still praying. I remember going to this one church, and it was called Holy Cross or something, very dramatic Catholic. I was like, God, please help me bear my cross, but don't make it be drinking. Like, I didn't want to not drink. Even with all the trouble I would get into with the drinking and people, like, I could be a Jekyll and Hyde personality, because all the feelings I had in me were coming up. Anyway, to end this whole part, I went to a nun who is this kind of a maverick nun. She was my guidance counselor, and I stayed friends with her my whole life until she passed away at the beginning of AIDS. I mean, not AIDS, COVID. And I came to her drunk one morning. I rang her bell and said, "Sister, I'm a lesbian." And she kind of sobered me up, and she looked me in the eye and she said, "Mary, I don't care if you're in love with pink elephants." She said, "Let's talk about your real problem, you're drinking." So that was one thing. She was getting her doctoral degree at NYU, and she knew a gay and lesbian alcoholism counselor, and she wanted to give me her name to go. And I said, "I'm not going. I don't want anybody to make me gay. And if I have a drinking problem, everybody I know does." Well, everybody I knew did, pretty much. Like, people I hung out with all drank heavy. And that was what we did. We went out to bars all the time. Also, I had a best friend, and she started to discern that maybe she might like women too, and so I was able to talk to her and say, and the thing was, I knew this at 5. She was figuring this out at 20. So she was a lot more mature about looking at it, not as like burdened by all the other emotional baggage that went with it. Her father was in AA. And one night when I went to the house, I used to go in there sometimes and be drunk and things. And it was her sister, actually. I was crying. They were all sleeping. I'd stayed up drinking past them. They went to bed. And I had to get in bed with the sister to go to sleep. And she did not like me. She was afraid of me. She was very intimidated by my drunkenness. But anyway, I was like, I don't want to have to lay next to her. But I get in the bed and I'm just quietly crying. And she turned to me and said, "Do you think you're an alcoholic?" And none of my friends would have said that to me. And I said, "Yes." So she said, "Look, you know what?" She goes, "We'll go wake up my father, because that's what they do in sobriety. They help each other." She goes, "But just make sure you're an alcoholic before we wake him up." So we went and we got him. And I sat up and I talked to him. And then there was another woman who was also in the sports who was sober. And I saw a big difference in her. So anyway, to make a long story short, I did go to see the therapist, and I did get sober. And I was 23 years old. And that's when my life just totally changed. I started to want to love myself and not want to hurt myself anymore. And I thought, well, I have to learn to accept myself. Also, I had gotten a job with the Sisters of Good Shepherd. They're pretty cool, like social worker nuns. They work with teenagers, and that was they work with families too, but I wanted to work with teenagers because I had been such a unhappy teenager. And this stuff I didn't even go into. Like, your story has so many different facets, but it was that nun that helped me in high school. Like, I was failing all these classes, and she came in and like intervened for me. And then I did really, really well, surprisingly, in my classes. I started studying, and I was shocked at how well I could do. So anyway, I was working for Good Shepherd Services as a child care worker, and the sisters had a really good influence on me. I connected with them as a lay associate. We used to meet once a month and pray and stuff like that. And I always played guitar. I played folk guitar at masses and stuff like that. So I was still doing that. I'm trying to think. I was trying to accept myself. And really, the sisters that I interacted with, like at this point, I wasn't being in the closet anymore. And I guess I looked stereotypically gay. So I wasn't, I didn't go into my life with these nuns, all of them or anything. But I think I was not in the closet. The woman who hired me, though, there was something going on. It was the 80s now, and it was the time of AIDS. And so people were dying of AIDS. And Archbishop O'Connor had made some big statement about gay people. And he really changed a lot himself over time once he got to know like gay people that were dying and went to like hospitals and things and saw them. But at the time, he was very militant about keeping Catholicism. I mean, that's when ACT UP started, when they started going into churches and like getting communions and throwing them on the floor and stuff, because they were protesting people dying all over the place. I myself had friends who died. I had two very, very close friends who died. One of them was my sponsor in the program. Like, they don't want women to be sponsored by other women or men to be sponsored by men, because the relationship gets very, very deep and close. So it can turn into being attracted and go in all kinds of crazy ways. But this guy was a gay man, and I didn't feel too, worried about that. But he and I were very close, and he said, I suffered a lot in my life, and when it gets bad, I'm just going to end my life. And I really didn't know what to say to him about that. I wouldn't have, and I didn't believe in it, but I couldn't say anything. I said, well, when you do that, will you at least kind of let me know what's coming? And so he did do that. And he did it in the early 90s when the World Trade Center was first bombed. I don't know if you remember that in the early 90s. The terrorists drove a white van into the bottom area of the World Trade Center, and a bomb went off, and they had to evacuate everybody. And he had been a fireman, and he was really very handsome guy. He could have been like a superhero. Like, he had a chiseled jaw and everything, and he was muscular. And that was the day he took his life. So I did lose that person. And the week before, which I didn't know, and I learned years later in my job, that before people actually may take actions on that, they can sometimes be in very good moods because they've made their final decisions. He called me up in a great mood. We knew another woman who had gotten sober with, who had AIDS from her husband, and had, he was like, oh, and that's when they first came out with the cocktail. And he's like, wow, maybe it's going to, cure Rose. And I thought, well, if he feels that way, maybe he feels like he's going to, and no, like a week later, he did that. Then I had another friend from college that I used to sing with. I sing. And he was a very close friend of mine. And, I went through the process with him. Like, I visited him and hung out with him. I got everything I could read about how you could get it, because I was afraid not to be near him or touch him or anything like that. And so I was able to get a back issue of the New York Times Magazine, and it really described, how you could catch it or not catch it. So I spent a lot of time with him, and we sang all the time, and he passed away. And it was very sad because his family had to keep it a secret. They were ashamed. And even when he was in the funeral parlor, they didn't want to touch him. They just did a closed thing, and they buried him in like one day. And so it was really traumatic. There were a lot of people in the program that I'm not really supposed to be saying I'm in AA, because they tell you not to do that. But I guess within the context of this, I don't know. But, there were a lot of people that were not just gay people. I went to a lot of gay meetings and things, but there were like straight people. I knew some straight people that died of it because they had come in, and in my generation, they were duly addicted. So some of them were IV drug users and stuff, and they died sober. I watched all these people go through this and not pick up a drink or a drug and stay sober and still talk about, their life in a positive way and give like a positive. I mean, it was unbelievable. So anyway, so then I guess over time, I found a way to stay Catholic. I stayed in the folk group. I moved in with my dad. He was sickly and he was older. And so we'd go to mass every Sunday together, and I played and everything. But I wasn't like holding any secrets or anything like that. But nobody asked. It was like an OS, don't ask, don't tell thing. Anyway, I also found other things like Dignity, where I could go like once a month to celebrate mass with other like-minded gay, lesbian, Catholic people. I found something called the Conference of Catholic Lesbians, which met at the Gay Center. And so I went to that a number of times. There was something called New Ways Ministry that was kind of started by a nun named Sister Janine Gramick. I don't know if she's specifically like working or if she's retired at this point, but there's a really good documentary about her going to talk to Pope Francis because she felt that she felt it was her calling and her mission to gay and lesbian Catholics. Anyway, when people started dying of AIDS, though, I couldn't understand, just like with my sexuality, like, why did God, who I love and who loved me, let this happen to me if it's bad and all this? And I remember seeing people dying and saying, God, where are you in all this? And then I realized I had to. It was sort of like the story where Jesus tells the disciples that they have to eat his body and drink his blood. And none of them really get what he's saying. And most of them leave, but then some of them still stay. And he says to them, like, aren't you going to go too? And Peter says, where shall we go? To whom will we go to? You have the words of eternal life. And that's how I felt too. Like, I don't understand this, but I love you and I believe, even if I don't understand what's going on, I want to continue to cling to you. So I thought, well, the only thing I can do is to tear everything down and start over again. Everything I ever learned or thought I knew, I needed to and the way I found God through AIDS was through the people who had AIDS that got up and stayed sober and helped other people no matter what they went through. And the people who loved them and sacrificed for them and worked with them, that were out there, nurses that were out there, doctors that, in the beginning, nobody really knew how you could really get it. Just like with COVID, how frightening that was, okay? So I started seeing God in the people and in the people and seeing Christ in the people that got sick. So anyway, I probably should stop right now because that's where maybe because the next chapter is when I kind of find Community of Christ. So,
Right. Well, that is an amazing story. And I just want to go back and pick something up because you have described a lot of very challenging situations in your life on top of finding yourself and your own sexuality and orientation and just all the things about our sexual beings. But near the beginning, you talked about your parents and the devout Catholics that they were just all in and all the practices and ritual and going to mass, and which is really beautiful. When I was a young child, we had friends that were Catholic, and we got to go to church with them one time. I grew up in Community of Christ, and I just absolutely adored the ritual and the veils and the kneeling. And so I've always had a very warm place in my heart for Catholicism. But you said that your parents had a real authentic love for God. And it just sounded like their authentic love for this God that they followed in this church that had been a vehicle of revealing God to them in the ways of Christ, shone through everything else, even the struggles. And then you talk about yourself and how much you loved going to church and how you were intrigued and interested. And you said, I was in love with God. And that's just so beautiful. And even as you question things, I can hear that your authentic love for God shining through, even when you come to the place where you're like, I just need to start over, with the whole God thing. And you're so aware throughout your life of God's presence and finding God during AIDS, among the sick, among the healers, among the friends and the family, and people who really put everything out there to support their loved ones in a time where there was great fear and trepidation because we didn't really understand the science behind AIDS, and not unlike COVID in many ways, but in other ways it was very different because there was so much stigma attached to
Mm.
it, and the process of death for someone dying of AIDS was just so cruel and difficult. So anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
So
And there was also sometimes like the visual of a person, you
yes.
knew, like they would get skeletal and they would get thrush, and they would some people would get Kaposi syndrome, which was like these sort of blood red
Hmm.
colored marks on their face and things like that. And so it wasn't like you couldn't or didn't know what was going on with these people. I mean, you wouldn't even recognize these people, who they were. And they were, and a lot of them were in their 20s. They were all,
Hmm.
a lot of them were just really young guys.
Yeah,
Um,
very young.
yeah.
So you mentioned that you went to college. Where did you go to college and what did you major in? Did you graduate with a undergrad degree? Tell us about this.
Okay, of course. I went to, well, high school was Bishop Kearney. So I went to Our Lady of Angels, Bishop Kearney, and then I went to St. Francis College in Brooklyn. Because I had not been a great student, like I was a kind of a get over, like until junior year, it wasn't like I had this superb, like GPA and, uh, great things I did or anything. So St. Francis took me, and it wasn't that far. But I was still drinking then. But I did pretty well actually, because I learned I could do well. And I took psychology because, okay, I wanted to learn why people did what they did. I didn't want to be hurt. I wanted to learn more about myself if I could.
Hmm.
And so, but I also was fascinated with psychology. I was fascinated with psychology and I was fascinated with theology. And I thought about studying theology, but I thought, how am I going to get a good job? Like I'm a nice working class Irish, Catholic American girl. Like you always care about getting a good job and getting, you want to make sure you get like a pension and you get like um, insurance coverage. You want to get all of those things. So I thought there's no way I'm going to be able to use, although I took some classes, but I didn't, minor in it or anything. But I had always wanted to study theology. But I studied psychology and then I graduated with a B average. It wasn't that great. I mean,
That's good. That's
sometimes,
good.
yeah, sometimes I could do very well. And then sometimes I did like meh. But again, I was still drinking and everything at the time through that. That was with the boyfriend and the drinking and the blackouts and all that stuff. So I graduated. And after I graduated, I had done an internship with a Good Shepherd Services and fields work and an internship in Brooklyn. And the social worker who I worked with said, go become a childcare worker. Like it's a good way. And I thought, oh, this would be a good way for me to see if I actually could work with kids, with teenagers, because my teen years were so painful and horrible. I just wanted to go back and be there for other teenagers. And because I felt like with teenagers, they can go one way or the other. And if you make sense to them and you're honest with them, they very well might choose a better path for themselves.
Hmm.
So I got a job as a child care worker in a residence. The nun didn't really want to hire me. I think she told me later that I looked too hip, you know, and I guess I did. I mean, I had like the 80s hair, like punky, not too punky. It wasn't like it was shaved off or anything, but I had like a little rat tail in the back
Hmm.
that was bleached. I remember going in and trying really hard to dress like a nun so that like they wouldn't, you know, uh, downplay my image. But she didn't want to hire me. So then I kept going on interviews, and like a month or two went by, and I had forgotten that I already went to this. So I applied for it again, and then when I was talking to her, she realized who I was, and I realized who she was. And because they didn't get somebody, because I feel like it was God's will, she said, all right, I'll give you a trial. You can come in and we'll give you a trial for like a month or something. And then I ended up staying there. I ended up becoming a supervisor. Before I left, I was the assistant director of the place. So I did really well there, but I also benefited from, remember I told you that when I was a teenager, I could turn my feelings off. And you can't do that when you work with teenagers. And this nun was like, they'll tell in a second if you're real or not. So, and I also realized the very first year I was there, I wasn't that great with them because I still didn't think that much of myself. So I thought, well, I'm nobody to aspire to be like or anything. So I was acting very like too rigid and too like the rules and all this stuff. And the kids did not like that. A few years in, my mother passed away. And after she died, I remember thinking, because she had been really sick for a while, I remember thinking, I'm so burnt out. I don't care anymore. I'm just going to go in and be me. And she said that was the best, work I did, was just being me. And then the kids really liked me. But I did use my singing and guitar playing. I put on shows with the kids and stuff. And that was kind of cool. And so I did that. And then I decided to go back to get a master's degree. You know why? Because the nun who helped me get sober came to me and said, why don't you go back to school? And I was like, well, I can't do that. She's like, you can do that. She said, you can do it. And even going to college, it was that nun that told me I could go to college, really. So I found all different programs and I went back to school and I got an MS in education in school psychology. So I got to continue to work with teenagers, but in the Department of Ed, and I got all my benefits like I wanted to. And so I did that for 25 years. I left the residence. In between, I worked at United Cerebral Palsy for a while, and that was a good experience too. But most of my career was being a school psychologist. And I was on a crisis team, and I think I was a good school psychologist. I think some of my anxieties were well used because I could get paperwork done and everything, get everything in. And I've always seen myself as my biggest gift is being a connector, that I can connect people with things. So as a psychologist, like I did counseling and I did crisis intervention and things like that, but I also tested kids and found programs for them, or I had the ability to pick who I would like to ask to be their counselor in the school, like who would fit best and things like that. So I feel like even to this day, I feel like that's maybe one of my gifts God gave me, is to step back and help connect things for people.
Thanks for joining us for part 1 of this Fair Trade episode here on Faith Unfiltered podcast. Watch for part 2 to hear the rest of Mary's faith transition story. If you'd like to hear more from courageous people willing to share the candid stories of their faith journeys and what brought them to Community of Christ, check out our Fair Trade series on faithunfilteredpodcast.org, or you can click on the link that's listed in today's show notes. Until next time, this is Blake Smith. I hope you have a great rest of your day.